Live Alive is one of the most unique JRPGs on the Super Famicom among a golden era of JRPGs, offering bite-sized scenarios as opposed to a long, consistent narrative. Each scenario has a different artist and plays out differently. We're going to lay out the story, gameplay, visual, and audio changes from the original Super Famicom game to its Switch remake. For the story and gameplay portions, we're going to speak on them broadly and then break down the changes that are within each scenario. This video will acknowledge what you can expect from the endgame, but no specifics as to what happens, how, or why, nor will there be any footage of it. For those looking to play the Super Famicom version on a Super Nintendo in English, we have the Aeon Genesis fan translation, which originally released in 2001, but these days if you download the patch, you'll be downloading the 2008 version that was rewritten and expanded. The patch also translates background text and reportedly has bug fixes. Additionally, there are additional patches you can apply for Spanish, French, or support for actual NTSC and PAL hardware. The fan translation features a different font per chapter to fit the eras. The translation is generally more on the literal side, though that being said, there are still some inaccuracies, and at the end of the day, keep in mind that this is of course still a fan-made translation, and they did the best with what they could. Of note is how the Prisoner in Edo, Japan, and Lawless in Near Future are given their actual names right from the get-go when not intended. The Prisoner is supposed to remain a mystery until the end, however his reveal is meant to hit you if you know the non-fictional figure he's based on. Then Lawless isn't a big deal since that's simply just his preferred nickname. Now in contrast to that, we have a remake of Live Alive for the Nintendo Switch, done in the HD 2D style akin to Octopath Traveler. The remake offers an identical amount of content with one exception: the very final boss has an extra phase that offers more closure than the original's ending. Now the game features English and Japanese voice acting for maybe 90% or more of the dialogue, and supports text for English, French, Italian, German, Spanish, Korean, simplified in traditional Chinese, and Japanese. Takashi Tokita, the director for both the original game and the remake, stated that some of the voice cast in Japanese were chosen based on who he imagined playing the roles back during the original game's development. That's not to undermine the English performance though, as there are some standout performances there as well. The official localization seen here adds some flair to dialogue, but accuracy-wise it's fine with only a few standout differences being known. And this is indicative of the changes that were made in the Japanese script of the remake as well. And as we delve into the differences per chapter, you'll see what I mean. While Live Alive has always and still does touch on sexual and suggestive themes, harsh language, and some pretty crude humor, a few things were changed in both the Japanese and English scripts together. So let's look at the Wild West as a first example. The alcohols that healed you but gave you a debuff, and cigars were changed into ointments that would buff you, and jerky. Additionally, Annie's nightgown that you can take and hand back to her was changed to a diary, even though it's still amusingly equipable like the nightgown was. Given the suggestive themes still present, alcohol, tobacco, and lingerie of all things being changed, seems to me were more deliberate choices due to Zero, the Japanese rating board. Otherwise, in the Wild West, there's also a mariachi band that now sings in Spanish. Because they speak Spanish out loud, their dialogue reads more like literal translation, akin to movie subtitles, even when there isn't any dialogue spoken. Prehistory seems to have been the largest challenge for localization regarding the last line of the chapter. The Japanese script utilizes wordplay that does not translate into other languages, and ultimately the ending of the chapter doesn't hit as hard as originally intended. Now the fan translation would be considered a successful interpretation, as it clearly made an impression on many who played it, but the official English localization here handling it just drops the wordplay present entirely, while the French localization, for example, still does try to make the wordplay work. Several items, actions, and character names differ from the fan translation all throughout, and a lot of those differences are in the Imperial China era. Consider that important for guides made for the original, including websites that copied guides of the Super Famicom version and subsequently don't match the remake. You'll also notice this issue with the Near Future era as well. In the Near Future, stealing from Teiko while in the bathroom stall is no longer optional. Accompanying this, the items stolen from her were changed to more mundane things, some of which differ in stats from their original counterparts. The Middle Ages is one of the most interesting localization instances because the entire chapter is written in iambic pentameter. In regards to every chapter, many nuances were changed here and there, though the story beats remained the same. References are more blatant blatant and don't avoid what they're referencing, whether they were in the original or if they're new to the remake. Now let's talk about gameplay. We'll discuss general overarching changes and then delve into a handful of each of the chapter's changes. The remake overhauls the balance of combat and implements several quality of life changes to exploration while leaving the content and some of the crypticness intact. Now Live Alive originally wasn't known for its difficulty in the first place. The most difficult parts of the game was the lack of the info provided to the player and obscure or cryptic objectives that encouraged you to properly explore. The remake still holds difficulty, but maybe not as much, but what the remake does is that it rebalances the challenge rather than bluntly make everything easier. An example for an easier change is that Baru learns her abilities one level earlier, and an example of a harder change is Oboromaru learns some of his abilities later. We'll also discuss why they rebalanced the gameplay shortly. So the numbers regarding stats, HP values, damage values, stat growth, when moves are learned, the range of some moves, enemy placements and formations have been totally rebalanced. Strategies that worked in the Super Famicom generally still apply though. The remake provides the player any and all necessary info for you when you're planning your turn. Weaknesses, resistances, damage, charge time, potential buffs and debuffs, enemy ATB, clearer descriptions and tooltips, detailed battle results, an indicator as to which enemy leads the rest of the enemies, and a glossary of battle terms you can pull up at any time. This enables the player to strategize more diligently than they could on the Super Famicom. Combat AI is generally less aggressive as it's far easier to back away from enemies to comfortably heal. Stats are hard capped at 150 now. If you wipe out a leader of a group of enemies, you'll still get drops from the non-leader enemies. The remake adds special defense as a stat, and enemies no longer share ATB like they did in the original, and all of these changes, especially the last one, I believe to be a huge reason why the combat was rebalanced in the first place, as you would never have taken consecutive non-counter attacks from different enemies before your turn before, so that combat AI may not be as aggressive, but when the enemy can attack as often as they do now, that's a pretty fair trade. Battling against multiple enemies, especially ones that can counter you each time, has to be treated a lot more carefully. Combat is also slower paced in the remake due primarily to longer action animations. The whole game itself is also much longer due to the voice acting as well if you listen to it. Now when it comes to exploration, a guide for the Super Famicom version will still lead you in the correct directions in the remake, though minor changes are made throughout for the sake of readability with the new camera angle. You've got optional tutorials as well as an optional radar that shows the direction of where your objective is, where you've been, and where you haven't been. This gives you a direction, but it doesn't say exactly what to do at these locations. More dialogue was also added to help flesh out the explanations of certain mechanics as well. Additionally, you've got autosaves, item pickups now sparkle. You can now pause within a chapter and go back to chapter select to resume or start a different one. You can also redo a chapter and it'll ask if you want to overwrite your prior completion data at the end instead of asking you to delete the data right when starting over, auto-advancing dialogue, and you can skip cutscenes. So let's go chapter by chapter now. In prehistory, on top of Baru learning her abilities one level earlier, if you give Baru equipment while she's hiding, she'll actually equip it instead of wasting it for the cutscene, and the scents linger and can now be followed. Also, the caveman minigame of the original was changed. Before you had to call in 20 cavemen and then speak to the 20th one as it enters to earn items. Now you just tell the caveman which haystack has more or less cavemen hiding in it, depend on which one they ask for. In Imperial China, while you can still utilize the training sessions to teach your pupils the Shifu's abilities, the pupils will learn all of the Shifu's abilities and moves on their own regardless. Edo Japan has a password mechanic necessary for your stealth mission and to prove you aren't a spy. The password changes whenever the bell tolls. In the original, you'd have to remember after every bell toll, but in the remake, Oboromaru tells you what it changed to. The stealth featured in this chapter was also made much more intuitive, adapting to how enemies follow and chase you now, whereas in the original, they'd simply stand around or move in your way, though some would follow you. Some fights in the original required you to enter the fight and then flee if you were going for a no-kill route, but thanks to enemies having to approach you, you don't have to enter nearly as many fights and flee to get around the number of enemies anymore. The options for this route, either no kills or 100 kills, are both considered challenge routes since you can still complete the chapter without going for either goal, but both the stealth, enemy AI, and password changes make the stealth route of the chapter substantially more bearable as you won't get physically blocked by enemies. A map is also provided to you to let you know how you're progressing. Some elements of this chapter were also marked clearer, like this trapdoor is made clear to you, and this hidden entrance is moved up a ladder, making it more evident that there's something there. Make no mistake though that there are still a few things that were obstructed in the original that are still obstructed here. Lastly, you can't bring the third party member into the optional super boss found in the water passage anymore. In the Wild West, the time limit is now on screen, the final boss's one-hit KO move now shoots sideways, but now there's boulders provided in the fight, and when you're dispensing items, Mad Dog gives you suggestions on what to give each person. In the present day, Masaru's self-healing ability is significantly stronger now. Not only is it now a more potent heal, but it has more buffs more frequently. You can freely refight any of the fights in this chapter now too, up until you defeat the last person. After that, there's no going back. In the near future, the item synthesis featured in this chapter is largely the same, except that the Fine Pearl no longer upgrades into anything, Taiko's secret stash can upgrade into more things than before, like the wrestling shirt or even the chick launcher, and the full body tights, Punk's jacket, and Taiko's picture now linearly upgrade into the biker's belt and the wrestling shirt, rather than a chance of only one of those. Akira was also significantly buffed. He may still arguably be the weakest of the main cast, but he is unarguably better than he was in the original. Many moves that had cast times before either don't have cast times at all or had their cast time significantly reduced. In the distant future, the Behemoth is the most significant change present. The Behemoth in the original game was one tile in size. Now he's huge and greets you with rumbling and screen shaking when he's close by. Additionally, the powered pie bar's use is now shown on screen and a map is provided to you. The treasures in the castle and dungeon in the Middle Ages in the original would turn into better items during the next chapter of the game if you left them alone the first time you go through. However, in the remake, you are free to take everything and the treasures will still respawn later. One last thing to note, after the Middle Ages in the original, your main character would be the only one to retain their equipment, but not their inventory. In the remake, everybody retains their full inventory and equipment except for key items and robotic enhancements. So, when you find robotic enhancements in the near future chapter, you should use them because they will not carry over anyways. Visually, as we'll see, we've got the HD 2D art style akin to Octopath Traveler. Building on that, we have more sparse moments where we have more dynamic camera angles. The game runs at 30 FPS where the original was 60. Character sprites are based on their original battle sprites, featuring animations that also build on the original battle animations, along with the influence of Octopath such as the unique walk cycles. Meanwhile, environments are totally redone from scratch, using the original map layouts as a backbone. We've got all sorts of extra effects now like particle effect, depth of field, and bloom. The UI was also redone from scratch and has a totally modern presentation. It's a more conventional, clean, and modern aesthetic that enables accent colors for each era to be emphasized. There's still a lot to appreciate in the original game's UI, where it used unique sprite cursors per era and different backgrounds per era. The games take different approaches with their forms, but functionally the remake offers so much more information and is laid out more conventionally. While the fan translation does have its unique fonts per era, the remake offers subtle differences like the text box backgrounds and unique item pickup text per character. The soundtrack of the game was redone under the supervision of the game's original composer Yoko Shimomura. And the one standout track is the opening for the near future, which is now sung. Sound effects were entirely recreated as well, though a few are references to the original, such as the battle transition. The Live Alive remake harkens back to the retro era of Square JRPGs, even with the modern game design influences present. But of course, it begs the question for you if the modern influence is too much, or if it's the reason you'll want to play this version. The unorthodox narrative structure and the gameplay of the game have been slightly tweaked and rebalanced, but overall keep the identity of the game intact. Though I feel the art style change is so drastic that the original game still holds its own identity, and which you prefer visually is up to you. That and of course the script changes made over the years may divide some folks, as the original Live Alive was simply from a different era, aka pre-rating boards. The original game wouldn't have been so coveted or had a cult following or even had such an early fan translation if its quality didn't speak for itself. However, it still wouldn't be wrong to say that remaking Live Alive was a great idea to keep the HD 2D train going, which as of right now, the next game coming is a remake of Dragon Quest III. And at the end of the day, more people can acknowledge and even enjoy this Super Famicom JRPG from Square that was almost lost to time. As we like to say though, there's no wrong way to play Live Alive so long as you enjoy the experience. So August was a rough month, but it's time to get back on track here. The next two videos are Final Fantasy XIII and also The Legend of Heroes Trails from Zero. Which comes first, I'm not exactly sure, but stay tuned for those. As always, you can find me on Twitter and support the channel on Patreon, and until next time, thank you for watching.